What's the deadliest bombing campaign, most destructive bombing campaign in human history? You know, I know what you're probably saying right now. What most people who don't know say when you say that is, well, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. That's what most people would say, because after all, you dropped a bomb and nuked an entire city. So surely that's the most destructive one, but you would be wrong. You see, we're going to do a World War II special now, and we're going to get to all kinds of things in World War II. Not near all of it, but we're going to do D-Day next and all kinds of things. But let's talk about the bombing for a minute, the atomic bombing. This is something that's still debated to this day. We dropped a nuclear bomb on a city twice, and we nuked all these people. Should we have? Should we not have? Was that wrong, evil, mean, inhumane? Was it right? Was it no? Well, let's go back to what I said in the very beginning. What was the largest, most devastating bombing run in human history? It was not Nagasaki. It was not Hiroshima. It was actually something called Operation Meeting House. Have you heard of Operation Meeting House? This is important. This is important when it comes to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Meeting House was Tokyo. You see, Tokyo, obviously you know Tokyo, this big Japanese city, home of the emperor. We decided we were going to bomb it to the ground. We had finally taken over enough islands in the Pacific that we'd gotten close enough to Japan where our long-range bombers, our super fortresses, could start flying these huge bombing runs over mainland Japan. And we started doing this. Remember, you know about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but people who geek out on World War II know we bombed every major city in Japan. All of them. They were all bombed. We were just bombing Japan. And we get this wild hair one day. What about Tokyo? Only instead of, a bombing run on Tokyo, what if we sent just a fleet of bombers over there with all kinds of different fire bombs and things and dropped them all on Tokyo and see what happens? This is Operation Meeting House. And over the course of 2 days, March 9th, March 10th, 1945, we went through and we dropped fire bombs and many different kinds of bombs, I should note, on Tokyo. Tokyo, this has happened very rarely in human history, went up in flames in something called a firestorm. Now, this is all going to come back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Just stay with me. A firestorm. Sounds scary, but what exactly is it? Is it just a lot of fires? Is it just a hot fire? No. There are a lot of factors that come into play in a firestorm. It hasn't taken place a lot, but we're talking about weather, moisture in the air, yes, fire. Essentially, you start enough of a flame, and there are enough outside circumstances that allow this flame to pretty much become a weather event on its own, a horrific, destructive weather event. People died in Tokyo. The fire was so bad. People died from suffocation while they stood outside. Do you understand what I mean? The fire was so hot and so ravenous, you could stand outside in the fresh air and die from lack of oxygen because the fire was sucking it all up. People melted into the road. They melted into the asphalt. Over 100,000 people burned to death, suffocated to death during Operation Meeting House. But you've never heard of it. Why? Well, because it wasn't enough. When we talk about Hiroshima, Nagasaki, how could you drop this bomb and destroy all these people? It's because we had just spent years, from December 7th, 1941, years fighting against the Japanese. And we discovered many things about the Japanese, their capability, their bravery, many things about the Japanese. And one of the things we discovered about the Japanese was they simply refused to surrender, no matter what. And we'd seen this in incident after incident after incident as we went through the islands. They would make these suicidal bonsai charges with nothing but a bayonet in their hands. These suicide planes, everyone knows about the kamikaze planes, suicide submarines. These people would just die rather than give up. And we firebombed Tokyo, and killed 100,000 of them. We melted them into the road, and they still wouldn't give up. And so what happened was, once we'd completed our takeover of Okinawa, we began our invasion of Japan. Now, we didn't actually put the boots on the ground yet, but a lot of people don't realize this. You can go look it up today. Huge armadas of ships with everything you can imagine: troops, supplies, food, bombs, bullets, preparing for a 2 million man invasion of mainland Japan that would have cost the United States of America 1 million people. When you're up against an enemy that committed 1 million people, there are videos out. You can go look them up to this day. You can see women and children in Japan bayonet training, preparing for the American invasion. They had said they have to kill all of us. And we just killed, as I said, 100,000 in the largest bombing run ever, and they still wouldn't submit. So we bombed Hiroshima. And still they wouldn't submit. And so we gave them a couple days, and we dropped one on Nagasaki. And still they wouldn't submit, at least immediately afterwards. But then someone talked some sense into the emperor, and there was still a lot of conflict in the high command of Japan, but then they finally ended up submitting. I want you to remember this about history. Whoever tells you about it, whether it's me, your history teacher, some book you're reading, documentary you're watching, I want you to remember something about history. We are all of us, anyone who talks about it, who's interested in it, we are all just people in the theater watching the movie, critiquing what we see. We're just in the audience. We weren't there. In this modern thing we have about judging all these historical figures, facts, and decisions from the past, I find it to be completely and utterly ridiculous. I'm just sitting here in the movie theater eating popcorn, watching the actors perform. I don't have any say-so whatsoever. I'm not there. I didn't act in it. I didn't write it. Remember, 1 million dead American boys. That would have been the cost of not dropping those bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's enough of the Pacific. Let's get to Europe. There's so much World War II. We could do a new special every week on World War II and not be done in 20, 30 years or whenever they kick me off the air here. But anyway, you ever heard of Operation Varsity? I bet you haven't. We'll talk about it next.
4 Hours of Fury fills a void in the historical record for World War II. The book predominantly covers the experiences of the American 17th Airborne Division, who along with the British 6th Airborne Division made up the two divisions dropped on the far side of the Rhine for Operation Varsity. The Air Armada was the largest assembled by the Allies in World War II. It consisted of over 1,500 transport aircraft, 1,300 gliders, 900 some odd British and American fighter escorts, and 240 bombers rigged to drop supplies. The title refers directly to the duration of the airdrop, from the moment the first paratrooper jumped out of the C-47 over Germany to when the last B-24 bomber dropped its cargo container. The result of the airdrop could be considered the largest bar fight in history. 17,000 troopers landed on over 2 divisions of German troops, and by that I mean literally on top of 2 divisions of German troops. It's important to remember that the German army was staffed by military professionals. Through their photo reconnaissance efforts, espionage networks, radio intercepts, they knew what was about to happen. They knew that Montgomery was going to drop airborne troops as part of his Rhine crossing. 4 Hours of Fury is the culmination of over a decade's worth of research. In that time, I interviewed dozens of veterans, Americans, Canadians, British, and German, explored the archives of 3 different countries, and ultimately walked the terrain itself in Germany. And all of this helped me gain a better understanding and insight into the events and sacrifices that took place on March 24th, 1945.
Those airborne guys, man, no thanks. Joining me now, that author right there, author of that book, 4 Hours of Fury, James Fenelon, former paratrooper himself. Okay, James, first of all, Operation Varsity. This is not an operation a lot of people have ever even heard of before, which is amazing. But for those who have not, what is it?
Yeah, it's a fair point. So Operation Varsity was the airborne component of what was the largest river crossing in military history. So as the Allies were pushing their way out of Normandy, making their way across the rest of Europe, of course, they had the setback during the Battle of the Bulge that you and many of your viewers are probably familiar with. But after that, as the Allies regained their momentum, they eventually were going to come up against the Rhine River, which was the largest water obstacle in Europe and was a natural boundary that had to be crossed in order to take the war into Germany itself, if you will. And it was at that time that the idea being the Allies were going to cut off the Ruhr industrial area, which is really where the industrial might of Germany was still belching out tanks and weaponry and anti-aircraft weapons. And so the goal of Varsity was to drop two airborne divisions. The American 17th Airborne was one of those. The other was the British 6th Airborne on the far side of the Rhine River in order to help secure that far side of the river as Montgomery then started pushing his divisions across amphibiously to land on the far side and then break out and start encircling and cutting off that industrial capability of Germany.
Now, speak on that industrial capability of Germany, because people see the bombs and bullets and all those other things. They don't see that part of it. Speak on that.
Yeah, I think it ties into kind of a general misconception about the end of the war and maybe perhaps why Operation Varsity isn't as better known as I think it should be. But, you know, the war in Germany didn't really peter out, so to speak. And, you know, despite the strategic bombing campaign, the Germans were still putting out a fair amount of industrial capacity. And by that, I mean still building aircraft, still building anti-aircraft weapons, building tanks. Now, they did have challenges, logistically speaking, around fueling those vehicles, moving them by rail to the front, manning them with trained personnel. But I think it's worth mentioning that the last full year of the war, April of 1945, the Americans suffered just as many casualties as they did in June of 1944 when they landed in Normandy. So that kind of shows you that, you know, the attrition was pretty steady throughout the war, right up until the very end.
What kind of attrition was it? And I ask it this way, what kind of casualties are we dealing with in that theater? Every theater, they have their own story. Every battle has its own story. You go to the Pacific Theater, 2/3 of those guys are down with dysentery and malaria half the time. What are they going down with in France and Germany?
Shrapnel. So, you know, to your point, there was a lot of, you know, you had similar statistics in the Battle of the Bulge, to be sure, from things like frostbite. Dysentery was also an issue there, but not nearly as bad as it was in the Pacific Theater. The main casualty producing weapon in Europe was shrapnel from artillery, frankly. And then, of course, that was followed by, you know, bullets and hand grenade fragments. But, you know, the war in Europe was not nearly as close combat, if you will, for lack of a better term, as it was in the Pacific, where you had, you know, the jungle kind of bringing everybody a lot closer than they would have preferred. Europe was you know, wider open, better for artillery observers. And then, of course, you also had, you know, armored vehicles able to maneuver much more freely in the plains of Europe as they did as opposed to the Pacific.
James, you think about gigantic operations like this one, you think about guys parachuting in, you've got a big amphibious assault, I always think about the civilians. What was it like for civilians in these places, from France to Poland? Otherwise, obviously, we know about the atrocities. You're some farm family in northern France. What is your life like? Do you just keep your head down and shut your mouth?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jesse. It's, you know, so, and it varied a little bit, but, you know, I'll start with your kind of the answer to what was going on in France and then contrast that with what happened in Germany and specifically with Operation Varsity. But to your point, you know, you're a farming family, let's say in France or Belgium, you're under occupation by the Germans for years. So, you know, obviously your lifestyle and your day-to-day life is going to be severely impacted by that. Of course, several, you had options. You could join the resistance or, passively resist, if you will, in your own way by not maybe producing as much vegetables or dairy as the Germans would have liked you to, because of course they're taking a lot of crops from France and Belgium to feed their own soldiers and things like that. And so they, and then they often got caught in the crossfire. If they got lucky, they were able to evacuate by the time the front lines kind of came through their area. And what was interesting about Operation Varsity is these guys are jumping into Germany, of course. This was an invasion of Germany. So all other airborne operations into France or Holland, those were viewed as liberations, right? Where the civilian population could be viewed as friendly. They knew that, of course, they were going to be inconvenienced by what was going on and, caught in the crossfire, as I mentioned. But the Americans and the British and the Canadian troops going into Germany had now an added element of stress. In addition to fighting the German army, there was a lot of concerns about what the German civilians were going to do, because, of course, at the time, propaganda was very loud and blatant about what the Americans were going to do to Germany. There was this line that, the Americans and the Allies were going to turn Germany into a giant potato patch when they took over. And so there was concerns of civilian resistance. And of course, soldiers don't necessarily care who's firing the bullet, whether it's a soldier or a civilian. It's incoming fire, and they're going to return that fire as with as heavily casualty producing results as possible.
And it didn't go that way for them from our end, but it did from the Russian end, well, from the Soviet end.
That's right. That's right. And that's another interesting comparison there. Of course, the war on the Eastern Front was by and far more brutal than it was in the rest of Europe, both from a weather perspective and to your there about the brutality between the two aggressors.
Oh, gosh, it sure was. James, thank you so much. The book is 4 Hours of Fury. I appreciate it, sir.
Thank you. Appreciate being back.
You bet. Good book. All right. We're not done. We'll be back. Obviously, when we talk about things like World War II, we're going to talk about war stories and heroism and things like that. It's also important to look back and remember all the endless horror. And there was a lot of it. There was a lot of death and murder and destruction and horrible things, and obviously the Holocaust. Joining me now, Ferris Castle. She is the author of the book Inseparable, about the Hess Twins. Who are the Hess Twins, Ferris?
The Hess Twins, Stefan, now called Stephen, Stefan and Marion were born to their parents, Karl and Ilse, who were German Jews who fled to Amsterdam in the 1930s, fleeing Nazi terror. The Hess twins were born 2 years later after the Hesses moved to Amsterdam. And they moved there because they felt that the Netherlands would be a neutral country and stay out of the war that was raging through Europe. So
it didn't work.
That worked for only a few
Go ahead,
years.
sorry.
And then the Nazi Germany invaded the Netherlands too, and the Hesses were trapped.
Okay, what was that like to be trapped? Was it ghetto? Was it concentration camp? What did they go through when the Nazis came in? Had to be horrific.
In the first few years, Karl Hess, who wrote a memoir about his experience, explained that it was quite survivable. It was not pleasant. Jews were forbidden to go into many stores and couldn't go into parks or any public places, but they weren't being killed. And that's because the Netherlands was such a different situation than, say, Poland, where there were so very many Jews. There were fewer Jews in the Netherlands, and also in the Netherlands, there were Dutch Nazis, and so there were Dutch people who followed Hitler. So they couldn't come in with guns blazing and attempt to control the population that way. They were able to control it with a tactic they developed for the Netherlands called the velvet glove. For the Jews, it was an iron fist inside that velvet glove.
Can you please describe the velvet glove? What is that?
It means they didn't lock up the population. They didn't run tanks up and down the streets. They tried to be friendly with the population and not arouse the Dutch people to rise up against them. So they definitely maintained their control of the Dutch people, but they didn't control them with the high level of militarism that most of the other countries that the Germans were invading experienced. They felt.
What's Bergen-Belsen?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
What's Bergen-Belsen? Sorry.
Bergen-Belsen, it's a concentration camp. Bergen-Belsen was set up rather late in the war. The Hesses had been deported to Westerbork, which was a transit camp, basically a gateway. It was a holding place for deported Jews in the Netherlands, who would then be sent to other camps, mostly Auschwitz and Sobibor, extermination camps where they would be immediately killed. But relatively late in the war, the Germans realized that, by the way, they might not win this war in the way that they expected. And they wanted to set up a special camp where high-profile Jews who may have been leaders in the community, may have been more well-to-do, like the Hess family were, and these Jews would be kept alive and put in a camp that was survivable, harsh but survivable, and used as possible prisoners to exchange for German prisoners of war. So it was a most unusual camp, harsh but survivable. And it was in Germany, not Poland.
How about that? Ferris, thank you so much. Her book is inseparable. If you want to read about this story of the Hess twins arriving at that camp, what they went through, I would highly recommend you go pick it up. Ferris, thank you so much.
I do just want to say, I'm sorry I didn't finish with Bergen-Belsen, that it started survivable and it ended up one of the deadliest camps there was.
Yes, it did. It was a horrible place. Thank you so much, Ferris. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
It really is a fascinating story, these Hess twins. And it's amazing that twins of any kind survived any of this. If you remember from the old Holocaust stories, you know, the horrific stories we all know, twins, they experimented on them. They were looking for them. That famous doctor, Angel of Death, Mengele, used to look for twins. He used to sit at the trains and look for twins to grab them. So it is an incredible story of evil. And look, we don't talk about that part of World War II enough, but that's something, isn't it? All right, we're not done. We'll be back. Veterans, especially older veterans, if you know any in your life, take some time and talk to them. Remember, those World War II veterans especially, we're almost out of those guys. They're almost all gone now. If you have 10 minutes, 15 minutes, an hour, talk to them. Soak up all the wisdom you can. Joining me now is someone who's done that, Andrew Bigio, author of the book, The Rifle 2, Back to the Battlefield. Andrew, what is the rifle? What are you talking about?
Yeah, the rifle refers to an M1 Garand, the standard rifle of that time of World War II. Everybody was issued and used, whether it was in combat or training. And I happened to use that rifle as a microphone with over 300 World War II veterans. I placed this rifle into their hands, recorded their reactions and emotions 78 years later after World War II.
What were some of their stories? Obviously, you can't share all of them. You put it in the book, but what were some of their stories? The floor is yours.
Man, everything from heartache to heroism to cowardice to brutal honesty. These guys really showed me that sometimes the greatest generation wasn't perfect. And I asked them on some of the tips and trade on how these younger veterans could live long, successful lives after combat as they did. And I think it was the first time really that I've seen in history where the youngest generation of veterans, me, who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, got to sit with the oldest generation of veterans and say goodbye to them and the takeaways. And I'm looking at all the different veterans on the screen here, and it makes me sad because, as you mentioned, we are losing 900 World War II veterans a day, and our youth are never going to be able to hold a conversation with these men and women.
What do they think about their service now as they look back? I know guys who served where we served, Iraq, Afghanistan, and others. They have mixed emotions, obviously, about their theater of war and what they did. But World War II guys don't generally seem that torn up about the cause of it, correct?
Yeah, it's we didn't get to choose our conflict, but we wore the uniform for the purpose of being just like our grandfathers and great grandfathers.
Yeah.
They were who we looked up to. A lot of veterans of every generation live in the shadows of these World War II veterans, but I got to sit and have some personal time with these veterans at the end of their life who taught me that war is not just black and white, and that they don't care if they were labeled the greatest generation and save the world, that they did some not so great things to win wars, stuff that we can't do today, stuff that will put US troops in jail if they ever tried to do it in order to win. And I saw a lot of guilt. I saw a lot of sadness and about civilians being killed during World War II. This was a whole different war where you took ground. When you took ground, you owned it, right? The more you advanced, you owned that territory. You could drop as many bombs as you want. It didn't matter. Collateral damage didn't matter. And I think a lot of that in their older years in life, they start to realize it, that that war is a crutch.
Would you speak to the guilt? I think that would take a lot of people back when they think about World War II veterans. That might be something people would associate with Vietnam or something because of pop culture. But for those who haven't talked to these guys or done much reading might be interested in why any of these guys would feel guilty about anything.
Oh, I've seen men at age 98 cry about particularly the civilians killed on Okinawa. And Okinawa was the bloodiest battle of the Second World War. It was one of the last battles. And these Okinawan civilians were caught in the crossfire between the Imperial Japanese Army and the U.S. Marines and the Army. And anything that moved at night, the Marines were taught to shoot, and kill. There was nobody was going to go to court or trial because a whole family got killed by a machine gun fire in the night. There was no night vision back then, and the Japanese were known to sneak up in American lines and slice throats and things like that. So this was something that hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed, and a lot of Marines have lived with that guilt over years. Those I've seen crying. And then, of course, the things about collecting human war trophies. Over 60% of the bodies on Japanese on Saipan, were missing teeth and skull fragments and things like that. And I think this has finally caught up with that generation.
Yeah, no, I've run into the same thing, especially with the Pacific War veterans, much more so in my experience than the European veterans. But getting through the rest of life, because these men, obviously you saw the pictures there, you were sitting down with them, they're old men, they've got families, their whole careers, retired, they're almost dead now. What do they think about their lives after they got back?
Well, it's funny because I talked to a veteran the other day from the 104th Infantry Division, and he says, I want to say the world is crazy today, but it's always been crazy. He's like, I'm 99 years old now. And as far as I can remember it, it's always been crazy. This saying that, oh, today the world's gone crazy. He's like, as far as I can remember it, it's been crazy, and I think that they've lived, like you said, career after career, generations, great grandchildren now that that they think that this is probably the standard in life, is that what it is now. And I think to live their own personal life, you got to worry about yourself. And the longevity of your life is staying busy, keeping your mind off the craziness. That might be multiple careers. That may be getting a job after you retire from another job. Focus on your family, your kids, and worry about yourself.
Andrew, thank you so much. The book is Rifle 2. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it. All right, we got final thoughts. Next. The greatest of all historical events. That is World War II. That's the way it's described. I didn't come up with that. That's the way it's described. But it is something we should look back at often, and we should try to learn as many lessons as we can from that gigantic, horrible, terrible thing. And hopefully we did that a little bit tonight, and we'll do it again. We'll be back.